In March of 1852, a New Orleans auctioneer named Horace Bellamy made an announcement that froze conversation across the French Market district. He was presenting a young enslaved man described, in writing, as the most physically perfect Negro specimen ever witnessed in Louisiana, a claim so scandalous that 11 plantation owners traveled from 3 states to verify it themselves. They expected a man built for labor. What they saw instead defied every rule, every tradition, every expectation of the slave trade. A face too refined for bondage. Eyes too unsettlingly calm. Skin so pale it almost passed for white. A body without a single whip mark despite 18 years in captivity. And a final detail that terrified everyone present. He refused to speak. Not one word. Not even under punishment. Within 72 hours, 2 bidders vanished. 4 men fell mysteriously ill. And by the end of the week, 6 men connected to the sale were dead. The white society of New Orleans whispered theories, witchcraft, poisoning, curses, madness. But they had no idea what the real truth was. By the end of that month, the auction house burned to the ground, Bellamy disappeared, and the enslaved man known only as Lucien was never seen again. What truly happened inside that building? What secret did Lucien carry that made powerful men fear him more than any rebellion? Before we uncover the disturbing truth, subscribe, hit that bell, and comment your state below. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. In the spring heat of New Orleans, 1852, the city behaved like a creature with 2 faces. By daylight it dazzled. Bright riverboats churned the Mississippi into golden foam, brass horns drifted from balconies, and Creole women in silk dresses glided along the French Quarter with parasols angled like jeweled shields. But beneath the perfumes and polished shutters, the city hid a darker pulse. One that throbbed in its alleyways, auction blocks, and backroom ledgers where human lives were tallied with the same cold precision as cotton bales. Bellamy's slave exchange stood on St. Philip Street, a place painted in fresh whitewash to disguise the rot beneath. Passing travelers often whispered that the building looked like a theater more than a market, its arched doorway framed by 2 columns, and its tall windows lined with crimson curtains that swayed like bloodied gauze whenever the river breeze slithered inland. But everyone in town knew the truth. Men entered this place to buy bodies, not entertainment. On that particular March morning, the city felt unsettled. The sky carried a film of gray dust blown in from the far-off sugar fields, muting the usual brightness. Live oaks along the street stirred restlessly, their branches dripping long Spanish moss that brushed the dirt road like funeral veils. Wagon wheels rattled over cobblestone, mixing with the cries of vendors selling oysters, tobacco, and hot beignet. And yet conversations kept circling back to a single rumor, one that traveled faster than the river tide. They said Bellamy had acquired something impossible. A pair of dockworkers were the first to speak it aloud that day. "You hear about that boy he brought in from Pontchartrain?" one muttered as he hoisted a crate onto a cart. "Boy? They say he near grown," the other replied. "And too pretty for the lash. You believe that?" "No," the first man answered. But the way he spat to the side betrayed uncertainty. "A slave ain't supposed to look like that. Sounds like trouble to me." Trouble indeed, though neither man knew how deeply. Inside the auction house, Horace Bellamy strode across the floorboards with the nervous energy of a gambler arranging a game he believed he couldn't lose. He was a thick-waisted man with thinning blonde hair and the smug certainty of someone who had risen from nothing by stepping on the backs of others. He had traded thousands of enslaved people over 25 years, and nothing shocked him anymore. Not the chain scars, not the trembling hands of mothers separated from their children, not the hollow stares of men priced by height and teeth. But Lucien had shaken even him. Bellamy paused near the side corridor where the boy was kept. He didn't open the door, didn't need to. A strange quiet radiated from the other side, a quiet that pressed against his ribs like a cold hand. And though the hallway was dim, Bellamy had the odd sensation that someone beyond the door was looking at him, perfectly still, perfectly aware. What he did not know was that Lucien had already memorized every sound in this place. The rhythm of footsteps, the snap of locks, the whisper of fear. Bellamy turned away, rubbing his palms as if trying to rid them of a feeling he couldn't name. He had paperwork to prepare, wealthy men to impress, and an entire city to astonish. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered. "He's just a quiet boy. Nothing more." But the rumor refused to settle. By midday, half the French Quarter had heard at least one exaggerated version of the tale. A slave with skin almost white. A face too perfect for any man. Eyes that looked straight through people. A strange refusal to speak even under command. Some whispered about witchcraft, others about forbidden bloodlines. A few joked nervously that Bellamy must have found an angel fallen from the heavens. No one laughed for long. Along Chartres Street, an elderly Creole woman leaned over her cane and whispered to a young seamstress beside her. "Child, beauty like that does not belong to us. It brings misfortune." The seamstress crossed herself. "Is it true he never talks?" "He does not need to," the old woman replied. "Silence is more dangerous. You mark my words." None of them knew that Lucien had not spoken since birth. None of them knew why. Not yet. Farther upriver, on the balcony of the St. Louis Hotel, a trio of wealthy planters discussed the same rumor over glasses of imported brandy. One scoffed, calling it a marketing ploy. Another laughed, declaring he would buy the boy just to see what the fuss was about. The third, a judge with a face carved like old marble, said quietly, "Beauty is a dangerous thing when placed in the wrong hands." The others dismissed him. They always dismissed the quiet voices. Back on St. Philip Street, the wind shifted. The moss hanging from oak limbs trembled as though reacting to something unseen. A dog tethered outside the butcher's shop began to whine, pulling against its rope as if eager to flee. An uneasy hush rolled through the marketplace, not loud but enough for attentive souls to feel the air tighten. Something was coming. Something none of them understood. And inside Bellamy's exchange, behind a locked wooden door, the boy at the center of the city's whispered frenzy sat perfectly still, watching dust float through a slanted beam of light. Lucien had waited 18 years for this moment, and the city had no idea how much its fate already belonged to him. Long before New Orleans whispered his name, Lucien's life began in silence on a worn-out sugar plantation north of Lake Pontchartrain, an estate called Red Harbor, though nothing about it was red or welcoming. The land was flat and tired, its soil beaten gray by years of extraction. Cypress trees circled the fields like patient witnesses, their trunks rising from shallow pools that reflected the sky in broken pieces. It was in the cramped berthing cabin behind the slave quarters that Adeline brought him into the world during a storm that rattled the shutters like angry fists. No one remembered hearing the newborn cry. They remembered only the midwife stepping back with a look of confusion deeper than fear. "Child, he a quiet one," the midwife whispered, staring down at Lucien's pale skin and uncanny stillness. "Too quiet." Adeline, exhausted and trembling, pulled him to her chest. "Baby just tired," she murmured. He gotta catch his breath. But Lucien never did, not in the way anyone expected. Unlike other infants who wailed for milk or warmth, he simply watched. His ash-blue eyes opened too early, tracking movement with unsettling clarity. When shadows moved across the wall from lantern light, his gaze followed them exactly. When someone whispered, he turned his head with such precise recognition that even the hardened overseer muttered a curse. It was the first time the plantation noticed the boy was different. It would not be the last. As the months passed, Adeline carried him to work in the fields, securing him with cloth across her back. The other women would sometimes peek over her shoulder and recoil quietly. "He ain't right," one whispered while cutting cane. "Looks like he come from some other place," another murmured. "Maybe he cursed," a third said, making the sign of protection. Adeline ignored them, humming to her son as she chopped cane in rhythmic strokes. She feared many things in this world, overseers, hunger, punishment, but she did not fear her child. What she did not know was that Lucien understood more than any infant should. He responded to tone, not words. To intent, not sound. When someone approached with anger, even before the footstep reached the cabin, his tiny hands would tighten. When someone meant kindness, he leaned toward them without hesitation. At age 3, something stranger happened. Lucien still had never spoken a single word. The plantation owner, Marcus Bourdain, summoned a physician from Covington to examine him. A plump man with a stiff collar and the smell of camphor trailing behind him, the doctor inspected Lucien with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. "He hears perfectly," the doctor said after snapping his fingers beside the child's ear. "He is not mute. He simply will not speak." "Why?" Bourdain demanded. The doctor shrugged. "Some children are slow to trust language." But the overseer, a man named Cray, muttered, "Or he just ain't natural." Lucien looked at Cray then, really looked, holding his stare with such calm intensity that the overseer stumbled back a step. A grown man, frightened by a child not yet tall enough to reach his belt buckle. That moment spread through the quarters like smoke. By age 8, Lucien's silence had become a fact of life. His pale complexion deepened but never darkened. His eyes grew sharper, more discerning. And even the most hardened men kept a respectful distance, though no one could explain why. Animals reacted first. Mules balked when he approached. Chickens scattered. A stray dog that roamed the edges of the quarters refused to come within 20 paces of him. The plantation wives whispered that he carried a saint's shadow. A Creole superstition meaning a spirit that didn't belong to this world followed him. Villagers along the lake called him l'enfant blanc de la nuit, the white child of night. They claimed he brought storms with him. They claimed his silence meant he was listening to things no mortal should hear. None of them were entirely wrong. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. Lucien had been observing everything for years, learning how the world worked, storing details with unnatural precision. Footsteps, scent changes, emotional shifts, the secrets people thought were hidden behind their words. By the time he turned 12, the plantation had begun to break in ways no one connected to him, at least not openly. A barn collapsed in perfect weather. A horse died without injury. Tools disappeared and reappeared in neat patterns no worker admitted arranging. A child who wandered too close to the bayou slipped into the water and would have drowned had Lucien not sprinted faster than anyone had ever seen him move, pulling the boy out without touching the reeds that sliced most swimmers. But the strangest moment came when Bourdain confronted him behind the main house. "What are you?" Bourdain whispered, unable to control the quiver in his voice. Lucien only tilted his head softly, a gesture both innocent and impossibly unsettling. That was when Bourdain made his decision. Quietly, secretly, without telling his wife or the other planters. Lucien would be sold. And as far away as possible. What Bourdain did not know, what none of them knew, was that Lucien had already sensed the decision days before it was spoken. He simply waited, silent, patient, watching the world shape itself toward the fate he had always known would come. By the winter of 1851, Red Harbor Plantation had begun to unravel in ways that no ledger could explain and no overseer could control. The land seemed to reject its own routines. Cane stalks that once bent obediently in the breeze grew brittle overnight. The well-worn paths between cabins turned soft and swampy even during dry days. And the air, usually thick with humidity, hung strangely still as if waiting for something to happen. Marcus Bourdain blamed the weather. His wife blamed mismanagement. The overseer, Cray, blamed laziness. But the enslaved people whispered the same name whenever backs were turned. Lucien. Not out of malice. Out of fear of the unknown. At 13, the boy had grown tall and lean, with shoulders that hinted at unexpected strength. His pale skin made him stand out among the field workers, as though he carried a different season beneath his flesh. And his silence, always that silence, filled spaces no words could reach. Cray despised him most. "Boy thinks he's better than us," Cray muttered as he strode past the cabins one morning. Lucien, sweeping dust from the walkway, didn't look up. "You hear me?" Cray stepped closer, enough for his shadow to cover the broom. Lucien finally lifted his eyes. "Come." Observing. Cray tried to hold the stare, but something primal flickered in his chest, a warning he could not name. He stepped back. That was the moment he decided Lucien needed correction. 2 days later, Cray took him behind the sugar mill. No one was present except a handful of trees and the faint hum of cicadas. "Stand still," Cray barked, raising his whip. Lucien stood still. Cray swung, but the leather never touched flesh. At the exact moment the whip cracked, a violent gust of wind shoved Cray backward, knocking him off balance and slamming him against a post. His breath left him in a choking gasp. He scrambled to his feet, eyes wide. He'd felt storms before. This was different. Too sudden. Too directed. You stay away from me," Cray stammered. Lucien said nothing. He simply stepped aside and walked away as if Cray no longer existed. What Cray did not know was that the entire plantation had felt the shift in the air at that moment. Animals stirred restlessly. Birds scattered from treetops in a frantic burst of wings. Even the river bayou beside the fields rippled though no wind touched its surface. The rumors deepened. But the true tipping point came in early February. A fire, small but fierce, erupted in the drying shed one night. Several enslaved men rushed to extinguish it, but the flames died before they reached the doorway, smothering themselves out in a way that defied every rule of heat and timber. "Fire don't behave like that," murmured old Jonah, shaking his head. Something blew it out. The next morning, the plantation's prized stallion was found trembling in its pen, refusing food and rolling its eyes wildly whenever Lucien approached. One worker whispered, "Animals sense things before we do." None of them were wrong. By late February, Bourdain had grown convinced that something unnatural gripped his land. He paced his parlor at night, tugging at his cravat, blaming bad luck, yet unable to ignore the patterns forming around the boy he'd intended to keep as a quiet house servant. Lucien's mere presence seemed to disturb the balance of the estate, yet Bourdain had no proof. Only fear. And fear corrodes reason faster than rot in river wood. So when the drowning happened, it cemented his decision. A young enslaved child, barely 7 years old, wandered too close to the bayou and slipped beneath the water. The screams drew workers running. Bourdain and Cray sprinted from the porch, their boots sliding in mud. Before any of them reached the bank, Lucien was already there, moving with a speed no one had seen from him before. He plunged into the murky water without hesitation and resurfaced moments later, the boy clutched against his chest. What stunned the onlookers wasn't the rescue. It was Lucien's body as he emerged. Not a single reed mark, not one cut, though the bayou was known for slicing swimmers bloody. He set the child gently onto the grass, water cascading off him like he'd risen from a different world entirely. Even Cray, who hated him most, whispered, "That ain't right." Bourdain stood frozen. A mixture of dread, confusion, and something close to awe twisted his face. "What are you?" he whispered again, same words as years before but now ringing with true fear. Lucien met his gaze, the calmness in his eyes deeper than the water he'd just crossed. That night, while the plantation workers slept fitfully and the frogs croaked in uneasy rhythms, Bourdain sat at his desk with a single lantern burning low. His trembling hand scrawled the decision across a ledger page. Sell the boy. Immediately. Discreetly. Transport under cover of darkness. No discussion. He arranged for 2 handlers from New Orleans, men paid well enough to ask no questions, to collect Lucien quietly and ferry him across the lake. What Bourdain did not know, what would haunt him for the rest of his life, was that selling Lucien would not remove the curse he feared. It would spread it. Lucien, meanwhile, sat on the cabin floor watching moonlight shift across the wall. He knew what was coming. He had sensed it days before. It was the last night Red Harbor Plantation would ever feel whole. The handlers arrived on a moonless night, just as Marcus Bourdain requested. They came in a narrow flatboat painted black to blend with the lake water, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle each footstep. Neither man introduced himself. They were not the kind who offered names. Their business was transport. Quiet transport. No questions. Cray brought Lucien to them in the dark, gripping the boy's arm too tightly, as if afraid Lucien might dissolve into mist if he didn't hold on. Lucien didn't recoil. He simply moved with the calm certainty he always had, his eyes fixed on the flatboat waiting at the shore. "Take him," Cray muttered, pushing the boy forward. "And don't bring him back." One handler struck a match, holding it close enough to Lucien's face to see the pale contours. The flame flickered strangely, bending inward as though drawn toward him. "That's him?" the handler murmured. Cray nodded. "Ain't nobody else look like that." The second handler leaned closer. "He's different." Cray turned sharply. "Don't start that. Just take him." What they did not know, what no one on that plantation understood, was that Lucien had sensed their arrival long before the boat touched shore. He had known this night was coming. He knew, too, that the plantation would not survive long after he left. The handlers bound his wrists loosely out of habit, not necessity. Lucien didn't resist. He stepped into the boat and settled at the bow, watching the faint moonlight ripple across the black water like thin cracks in dark glass. As they pushed away from the shore, Cray remained standing, arms crossed tightly. He felt a sudden chill, though the night was warm. Lucien looked back only once, one silent, unreadable glance that made Cray's breath hitch. Later, Cray would swear that the wind shifted the moment the boat vanished into the lake mist. And by morning, the plantation's main barn collapsed, crushing half the season's tools beneath the rubble. But Lucien never turned back. The journey across Lake Pontchartrain was quiet except for the rhythmic splash of oars cutting water. Cypress trees jutted from the lake like dark sentinels, their branches draped in moss hanging low enough to brush the handler's shoulders. The air smelled of brine, rotting wood, and distant thunderstorms. "You don't talk, do you?" one handler asked. Lucien didn't answer. The handler chuckled nervously. "Good. Talkers make trouble." The other man, older and sharper, watched Lucien with narrowed eyes. "Trouble maybe. But this one feels like something else." They continued in silence. Hours later, the faint glow of New Orleans appeared, lantern lights flickering along the docks, ships rocking gently against wooden posts, the smell of tobacco, sweat, coffee, and river mud drifting across the water. The city at night looked like a sleeping beast, beautiful, restless, and dangerous. Lucien's gaze didn't shift as they approached the landing ramp where Horace Bellamy waited, carrying a lantern that cast long, trembling shadows. He paced impatiently, his coat still buttoned from the formal dinner he had abandoned when the handlers notified him they were arriving early. When Bellamy first saw the silhouette of the boy in the boat, he frowned. When the lantern illuminated Lucien's face, he froze. "Good Lord," the words escaped him before he could restrain them. Lucien stepped onto the dock with a quiet grace that felt almost deliberate, as though he were allowing the wood to hold him rather than merely walking. Bellamy circled him slowly. "You stand like you were taught by someone important." Lucien didn't respond. Bellamy leaned closer. "And you do not speak." One of the handlers shrugged. "Not a sound the whole way. Not even when the water got cold." Bellamy lifted the lantern higher, examining every detail. The pale tone of Lucien's skin, the symmetrical features, the unsettling calmness in his eyes. 18 years in bondage, Bellamy murmured, and not a single lash scar? Not even a welt. None, the handler confirmed. Owner said he never needed discipline. Said the boy understood everything without explanation. Bellamy's breath quickened. He wasn't imagining the value of what stood before him. He was calculating it. What he did not know, the narrator whispered across the scene, was that Lucien had already sensed Bellamy's greed before the man ever stepped onto the dock. Bellamy motioned to his workers. "Bring him to the exchange. Quietly. The city wakes early." Lucien walked beside them, his footsteps soundless on the planks. Dock workers paused mid-task, staring. One man dropped his coil of rope. "Looks like a ghost," he whispered. "Not a ghost," his friend answered. "Something worse." As they made their way through the French Market district, New Orleans revealed itself in layers, narrow alleys filled with cigar smoke, taverns still echoing with late-night laughter, carriages rattling down stone roads slick with dew. Every few steps, someone glanced at Lucien and then quickly looked away, uneasy without understanding why. Inside Bellamy's auction house, the torchlights flickered as if reacting to his arrival. Bellamy felt a strange shiver ripple through the room. The curtains swayed though no breeze entered. The horses tethered behind the exchange stomped and snorted. Lucien simply stood still in the center of the floor, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. Bellamy steadied himself and whispered, "You will make me richer than any man in this city." But Lucien looked past him, at something Bellamy could not see. Something waiting. Something inevitable. This was only the beginning. By sunrise, the rumor of Bellamy's acquisition had already slithered through every parlor, tavern, law office, and plantation house corridor from the French Quarter to the Garden District. New Orleans carried gossip the way the Mississippi carried silt, endlessly, restlessly, reshaping the landscape with every passing hour. And on this morning, the city seemed determined to remake itself around a single name, Lucien. Bellamy stood at the top of the exchange stairs, wiping perspiration from his forehead despite the morning chill. He'd barely slept, turning over possibilities in his mind. The bidding wars, the elite visitors, the kind of price that might make newspaper columns whisper about him for months. Wealthy men loved to parade their excess. And nothing signaled status more powerfully than owning a slave so rare, so coveted, so bizarrely beautiful that rivals could only stare in envy. So Bellamy sent invitations, 12 notes written by hand, sent with runners, each sealed with red wax and containing only one line. "You will wish to see what I have acquired. Horace Bellamy." 11 men answered. They arrived before noon. The first to step through the exchange doorway was Judge Ambrose Keller, a heavy-set man with silver hair, stern eyes, and a reputation for ruling harsher than the slave code demanded. He studied Lucien with a professional detachment that barely disguised fascination. "Unusual," Keller murmured. "He stands like a free man." Bellamy forced a grin. "He stands exactly as I allow him to stand." But Lucien's posture remained unchanged, tall, calm, balanced, as though courtrooms and judges meant nothing to him. Behind Keller came Dr. Percival Hartlow, a physician from Alabama known for measuring skulls and temperaments with obsessive precision. He circled Lucien slowly, tapping a notebook. Symmetrical facial structure. Excellent musculature. Unusual dermatological tone. He leaned closer. Eyes like storm glass. Lucien looked back without blinking. Hartlow frowned. "Does he understand speech?" Bellamy gestured toward Lucien. "Boy, lift your arm." Lucien lifted his arm. The 9 men who entered after them saw variations of the same demonstration. Each reacted differently. Everett Rousseau, a rice baron from Mississippi, smirked. "Pretty face on a field hand is wasted." Nicholas Durant, a sugar magnate, whispered, "Women will talk about him more than us." Louis Duret, a Creole wine merchant, muttered, "He is too perfect. It makes the stomach uneasy." Others said little, though their silence was louder than their words. The last arrival was Henri Marchand, a man so wealthy, so deeply entrenched in Louisiana's elite families, that his presence alone shifted the mood. His cane clicked sharply on the wooden floor as he approached Lucien. He studied the boy for a long time, long enough that even Bellamy felt the seconds stretching. Finally he spoke. "He is not natural born to a place like this." Bellamy stiffened. "He was born on a plantation north of the lake." Marchand shook his head. "I did not ask where he was born. I said he is not of this place." Before Bellamy could respond, Lucien turned his head slightly toward Marchand, as if acknowledging the man's insight. A murmur rippled through the room. What he did not know, the narrator whispered, was that Marchand recognized something old in Lucien's face. Something he had seen once before in a portrait long hidden from public memory. Bellamy clapped his hands to reclaim authority. "Gentlemen, you are witnessing the future of the trade. I present to you a specimen with no defects, no resistance, no scars, no history of disobedience, and a physical beauty that even the finest Creole women would envy." Rousseau snorted. "Beauty does not plow fields." Keller countered, "No. But it commands a higher price." The doctor stepped forward again, fingers trembling with scientific hunger. "May I touch him?" Bellamy nodded, but the moment Hartlow reached out, Lucien's expression changed, not violently, not fearfully, but with a stillness so absolute that the room itself seemed to hold its breath. Hartlow's hand brushed Lucien's wrist. He jerked back. "Cold?" he whispered. "His skin is cold as river stone." Bellamy forced a laugh. "The building is drafty." "No," Hartlow insisted. "This is something else." Marchand lifted an eyebrow. "Are we bidding on a man or a phantom?" Some of the men laughed, but unease seated itself quietly among them. Lucien's eyes moved from face to face, studying each with an attention far too precise. It made grown men shift in their shoes, made the judge swallow tightly, made the doctor wipe his palms more than once. Something about the boy felt like being observed by the very shadows behind him. No one dared speak the fear forming in their minds. This boy sees more than he should. Bellamy, eager to dispel the unease, clapped his hands again. "The auction will be held in 2 nights. Private showing. Highest bidder only. Let us not pretend you haven't already decided to attend." He smirked. "And bring your wallets swollen." As the men filed out, each one paused for a final glance at Lucien, unable to look away, yet unwilling to stand too close. When the last footstep faded, Lucien lowered his gaze to the floorboards. He understood what was coming. But none of them, not Bellamy, not the doctor, not the judge, not the 11 men whose greed filled the exchange like smoke, could foresee what their desire would cost. Within a week, 6 of them would be dead. The night before the auction arrived like a storm that refused to break. New Orleans held its breath. Bellamy's auction house, usually noisy with preparation, sharpening quills, polishing chains, sweeping floors, felt strangely subdued. The workers moved with the caution of men who sensed something was wrong but could not articulate why. The candles burned too low. The shadows lingered too long. Even the usually cheerful sound of distant riverboats seemed muted, as though the Mississippi itself was listening. Lucien had been placed in a private holding room, separated from the other enslaved people on the property. Bellamy insisted it was to maintain value. Everyone else knew it was because his presence unsettled the entire household. Bellamy approached the door, key in hand, but paused when he felt the wood beneath his palm vibrating softly, as if something inside the room breathed in patterns that didn't belong to human lungs. He unlocked the door. Lucien sat where he had been sitting for hours, straight-backed, legs folded, eyes open, watching the flickering lantern on the table. The light reflected in his pale irises, making them look like fractured ice. "Boy," Bellamy said softly. "Stand." Lucien stood. Bellamy stepped closer, trying to maintain the confidence of a man who'd spent decades commanding bodies like currency. "Tomorrow you will fetch more money than any slave ever sold in this city. You understand that, yes?" Lucien blinked once. Bellamy's mouth twitched. "I will take that as understanding." Silence pressed against the walls. Bellamy rubbed his temple. "You haven't spoken once since you arrived. Don't suppose you plan to tomorrow either." Lucien's gaze didn't waver. What he did not know was that Lucien had already chosen when he would break his silence. "And to whom?" Bellamy stepped back. "Fine. Let them project their desires on you. Silence makes men foolish. Use it." Then he paused, troubled by the sudden draft brushing the back of his neck. "Boy, are you humming?" Lucien didn't move, didn't open his mouth. But Bellamy swore he heard a faint sound threading through the room, something distant, melodic, like a song carried across a graveyard. He stepped out quickly, slamming the door behind him. In the hallway, two workers whispered anxiously over a lantern flame that wouldn't stay lit. "Ever since that boy arrived, candles die like they scared," one muttered. The other nodded. "Animals too. My mule refused to stand near the exchange. Backed out the harness twice. There's something off about him," the first said. "Something that ain't right." "What you think he is?" The man swallowed hard. "Not sure. But I know this. Some beauty ain't meant for this world." Neither of them saw Lucien standing behind the door, listening, understanding every word. Outside, the wind shifted violently. A distant thunder cracked in the direction of the lake, though no storm had been forecast. The oaks swayed, shedding moss that drifted across the ground like pieces of tattered shrouds. Across town, the elite men who'd been invited to the auction tossed uneasily in their beds. Everett Rousseau dreamed of drowning in dark water. Judge Keller woke gasping, certain someone had been standing at the foot of his bed. Dr. Hartlow scribbled frantic notes in a journal he could not read once morning came. Henri Marchand sat awake by candlelight, staring at an old portrait hidden in a drawer, one whose face resembled Lucien's far too closely. None of them spoke of their fears the next day. Pride prevented confession. Back at the exchange, Bellamy paced the floors, checking the locks, repositioning lanterns, instructing workers to polish the viewing platform. But no matter how many times he inspected the room, it always felt colder when he walked past Lucien's door. "Get more candles?" Bellamy snapped. "This place looks like a mortuary." One worker nodded, but as he hurried off, every candle along the wall extinguished themselves simultaneously. One by one. Soft puffs. Darkness. The worker froze. Bellamy cursed. "Draft. Fix it." But as he tried to relight the candles, each newly lit flame bent sideways, as if pulled toward the locked door of Lucien's chamber. Bellamy's hands trembled, then steadied. Greed had always been stronger than fear. He whispered under his breath, "Richest auction of the year, richest in the nation. Nothing will ruin this." What he did not know was that ruin had been set in motion long before this night. Lucien's presence was not the origin of the disturbances. It was the response. Near midnight, while Bellamy climbed the stairs to his private office, a soft knock echoed from the exchange's main entrance. His brow furrowed. At this hour? Who would dare? He opened the door cautiously. A woman stood there. Tall, elegant, wrapped in a dark green shawl embroidered with gold thread. Her eyes were a deep, ancient brown that held stories far older than the city. Her accent, light, French, clipped, identified her as Creole elite. "Good evening, Mr. Bellamy," she said softly. Bellamy swallowed. "Do I know you?" "You do not." Her eyes shifted past him toward the corridor where Lucien was kept. "But I know what you have taken into this house." Bellamy stiffened. "If you're here to negotiate privately..." "No." Her voice silenced him instantly. "I am here to warn you." She stepped inside, closing the door with delicate fingers that nonetheless felt dangerous. Bellamy forced a laugh. "Warn me of what?" Her gaze lingered on the locked door down the hallway. "Of the boy," she whispered. "Of what he carries. Of what he awakens in the men who try to claim him." Bellamy's bravado fractured. "You know him?" "I know his bloodline." She stepped closer, lowering her voice until it sliced like a blade. "And if you sell him tomorrow, every hand that touches him will bleed." Bellamy felt the temperature of the room drop. But before he could speak, she turned sharply and left, pulling the door shut behind her. Bellamy stared after her, shaken. For the first time since Lucien's arrival, he wondered if he had truly made the greatest purchase of his life, or the last mistake he would ever make. By the following evening, New Orleans trembled with a nervous anticipation that even the brass bands could not drown out. As dusk settled over the Mississippi, the humid air thickened into something heavy, expectant, electric, unsettling. Lanterns flickered across the French Quarter, casting gold halos that seemed to shiver above the cobblestones. Bellamy's auction house glowed unnaturally bright, every window ablaze, as though the entire building were bracing itself for what was about to unfold. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Elite men filled the hall in a dense wall of perfume, tobacco, sweat, and whispered rivalry. The 11 bidders, plus a handful of speculators who had managed to bribe their way in, clustered near the platform, all eyes flicking toward the small door through which Lucien would be revealed. Their voices buzzed like wasps. Will he truly look as they say? I hear he is untouched, untouched. In this business that is worth more than gold. More than gold? Another scoffed. More than blood, maybe. Judge Keller intends to buy him outright. No, Marchand has the deepest pockets. Doesn't matter, said a planter from Baton Rouge, his voice cracking with nerves. There's something wrong with that boy. I felt it the moment I saw him. Bellamy moved through them like a conductor preparing an orchestra. His face glistened with sweat, not from heat but from the weight of ambition. He knew tonight would either cement his legacy or destroy it. The woman's warning from the night before replayed in his mind, but he shoved it aside. Warnings were for men who could afford fear. Bellamy could not. He stepped onto the platform, raising his hands. Gentlemen, if I may have your attention. The murmurs died. A hush descended so abruptly that even the horses outside seemed to stop their restless shifting. Bellamy's voice rang through the hall with practiced authority. You have heard rumors. Tonight you will see the truth. A young man of extraordinary appearance, extraordinary health, and extraordinary potential. He gestured toward the side corridor. Bring him out. The crowd leaned forward instinctively. Two workers opened the door, stepping aside as Lucien emerged into the golden lamplight. For a moment, the room exhaled all at once, as though every man had been struck silent by the sight before him. Lucien stood still on the platform, posture flawless, face expressionless. His pale skin caught the lamplight in a way that made shadows cling to the edges of his features, giving him an almost sculpted appearance. His eyes, ash blue and unblinking, swept across the room with calm precision. It unnerved even the boldest among them. The first whisper rose from the back. Dear God. The second followed. It's true. He's breathtaking. But the word didn't carry admiration. It carried fear. Bellamy felt triumph swell in his chest. Observe his symmetry, his bone structure, his physique. 18 years old. No deformities. No scars. No history of disobedience. No speaking to inflame rebellion among others. Lucien, for the first time, turned his gaze slowly toward Bellamy. A movement so smooth, so deliberate, that several men shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Hartlow pushed through the crowd. I request a physical examination, he declared breathlessly. Scientific interests require verification. Bellamy nodded. Hartlow approached, lifting Lucien's arm, placing fingers at his wrist, pressing lightly into the skin. His pulse, Hartlow frowned. Slower than expected. Controlled. Too controlled. Marchand stepped forward as well, studying Lucien's face with an intensity that bordered on reverence, or dread. Your silence, he murmured to the boy. Is it refusal or restraint? Lucien didn't answer. Marchand's expression tightened. It is restraint. The men around him stiffened. No one wanted to confront the idea that the boy's silence was a choice. Bellamy clapped once, forcing the tension back into structure. Let us begin the bidding. Before he could speak the opening price, a planter from Natchez raised his hand. Before we bid, I must ask, does he understand commands? Bellamy nodded. Boy, he ordered, step forward. Lucien stepped forward. Lift your chin. Lucien lifted his chin. Turn your head left. Then right. He obeyed, smoothly without hesitation. The room erupted in excited murmurs, but underneath the eagerness ran something darker. The bidders' eyes glimmered with desire, but also unease, as though they sensed a boundary they were not meant to cross. What none of them knew, the narrator whispered, was that Lucien was not obeying Bellamy. He was observing the men who intended to own him. Bellamy inhaled deeply. Opening bid, $5,000. Every man in the room snapped to attention. 6, 7, 8,000, 9. Voices overlapped, desperation sharpening them. Judge Keller raised his cane. $10,000. Gasps rippled through the hall. Bellamy's pulse hammered. He had dreamed of this number. He had never heard it spoken aloud in his auction house. Hartlow pushed forward, eyes feverish. 12,000. The hall erupted in chaos, shouting, gesturing, elbows thrown. For a moment, Bellamy thought he would lose control entirely. Then the lantern above the platform flickered. Once, twice, then nearly went out. A coldness swept through the room that no open window could explain. Lucien lifted his gaze to the lantern as though acknowledging something only he perceived. The men froze. What was that? Someone whispered. No one answered. Outside, thunder rolled again, despite the clear sky. Inside, Lucien stood unmoving, waiting, listening, aware of everything the men could not see. The bidding had only just begun, but the ruin had already started. The bidding rose like a fever, swelling and collapsing in waves as the men fought not with fists, but with numbers sharp enough to cut reputations to ribbons. Sweat dampened collars. Voices cracked under strain. The air turned thick with the metallic scent of desperation. Bellamy stood on the platform, chest heaving with triumph he could barely contain. "This is it," he whispered to himself. "This is legacy." But not a single man in the hall noticed Lucien watching them, each bidder, each twitch of greed, each shift of posture, as though he were observing a board of pieces being moved toward an end already decided. The lantern above the stage flickered again. A low groan of wood rolled through the rafters, like the building itself warning them. 13,000. Hartlow barked. 13,500, Keller countered, sweating through his shirt. 14, shouted Rousseau, jaw clenched as if he were already regretting the number. But Marchand did not shout. He stepped forward with calm, terrifying certainty. 20,000. The room choked on the number. Even Bellamy froze. $20,000. The price of an entire plantation. Enough to rebuild a life, a fortune, a dynasty. Men stared at Marchand as though he had stepped into the realm of the unhinged. But Marchand's gaze never left Lucien. "He is not like the others," he murmured. "He is not meant to serve." The others dismissed his words as arrogance, but Lucien tilted his head slightly, acknowledging something only he and Marchand understood. Bellamy cleared his throat. 20,000 is unprecedented. Are there any further? Before he could finish, Hartlow shoved forward. "This is nonsense," the doctor snapped. "Before I raise a single dollar beyond that figure, I require a more thorough examination. The boy's physiology is abnormal." Bellamy forced a smile. "Certainly, doctor. A demonstration, perhaps?" The crowd murmured eagerly. Hartlow approached Lucien again, hands trembling despite his attempts at professionalism. He pressed his fingers to Lucien's wrist, expecting warmth, a pulse, something human. Instead he staggered back. "Cold?" he whispered. "Colder than before." The men leaned forward. "It is as though he absorbs heat." Lucien blinked once, slow and deliberate. Keller scoffed. "We're not paying for ghost stories. He's a slave, not a specter. Let the doctor finish." Hartlow, offended, reached for Lucien's wrist again, but this time he held it tighter, examining the network of pale veins beneath the skin. "You feel nothing?" Keller asked impatiently. Hartlow didn't respond, because something was happening. Slowly, Hartlow's face drained of color. His pupils widened. His breath grew shallow. What is?" He stumbled backward, clutching his chest. "Hartlow." Rousseau barked. "What's wrong with you?" The doctor tried to speak, but his lips barely moved. His breath rattled. His knees buckled. Then silence. Hartlow collapsed onto the floorboards, eyes wide, frozen in terror. A gasp rippled through the hall. Men recoiled, stepping back so quickly chairs toppled behind them. Keller knelt, felt for a pulse, and looked up with a face twisted by dread. "He's dead." Dead. The word struck the room like a thrown stone. Someone crossed himself. Someone else whispered, "It's the boy. I told you he's cursed." Another muttered, "The air. Something's wrong with the air." Bellamy's heart pounded. "It was the heat," he insisted. "It's stifling in here." But the truth shivered under the surface. The hall wasn't hot. It was cold. Unnaturally cold. And Lucien hadn't moved an inch. He simply lowered his gaze, expression unreadable. What none of them knew, the narrator breathed, was that Lucien had felt the doctor's intentions the moment the man touched him. And intentions carry consequences. Marchand stepped forward, cane tapping sharply. "This auction is over." Bellamy spun toward him. "Over? Are you mad? We have a price." "You will destroy yourself," Marchand hissed. "And everyone here if you continue." But Keller raised his cane. "Enough. One man's death means nothing if we can secure what we came for." Shouting erupted, fear and greed wrestling violently. Rousseau pointed at Lucien. "He killed the doctor." A planter shouted, "We saw nothing. He didn't move." "Death follows him," someone whispered. "You can feel it." Lucien lifted his eyes slowly toward the crowd. The murmuring stopped. No threat. No malice. Just a quiet understanding as though he already knew the shape of their fates. Bellamy wiped sweat from his brow. "This was an accident," he croaked. "The bidding continues tomorrow night. We'll resume once tempers cool." But even as he spoke the words, he felt something tightening in the room, something ancient and merciless. The doctor's body was carried out in silence. The men departed in uneasy clusters. Lucien watched them go, eyes following each one with the calm of a man observing an hourglass empty judgment grain by grain. Within 2 days, another bidder would be dead. And by the end of the week, 6 men who had touched, measured, or claimed him would meet the same fate. The ruin had begun, and none of them could stop it. Night descended upon New Orleans with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made even the gas lamps flicker as though hesitating to illuminate the streets. Clouds gathered above Jackson Square, heavy and swollen, threatening a storm that refused to break. The city had watched Dr. Hartlow's body carried from the exchange earlier that evening, and whispers had spread faster than river fog. Dead in an instant. No warning. His eyes, wide as if he saw something coming for him. Men spoke of it with trembling bravado. Women murmured behind lace fans. But the truth that threaded through every conversation was simple. The boy had something to do with it. Bellamy spent the evening pacing his office, clutching a ledger he hadn't read for hours. The ink smeared beneath his fingers. The numbers blurred. His breath grew shallow. He could feel the weight shifting against him, something unseen, something he could not negotiate with or outbid. At last, frustration erupted. "This is madness," he growled, slamming the ledger onto the desk. One man dead and suddenly the whole city losing its mind. But the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. A knock echoed through the empty hall. Too soft for a worker. Too precise. Bellamy stiffened. "Who's there?" No answer. Another knock, 3 taps evenly spaced. His heart drummed in his ears as he approached the door. When he opened it, a gust of cold air swept inside, extinguishing the lantern behind him. In the doorway stood a woman dressed in deep indigo silk, her shawl embroidered with threads of gold older than Louisiana itself. Her dark hair framed a face of sharp beauty, but her eyes, deep ancient brown, held a solemn knowledge that made Bellamy step back without realizing it. "You again?" Bellamy whispered. "What do you want?" Genevieve Duclair stepped inside with slow grace, closing the door behind her. "You have ignored my warning." Bellamy steadied himself. "A doctor died. That is all. Men die often in this city." "Not like he died," she murmured. Her gaze drifted toward the corridor where Lucien was kept, as though she could feel the boy through layered walls. "I came because I saw the storm gathering," she said quietly, "and because I know the cost of bloodlines forgotten." Bellamy swallowed. "Bloodlines?" She turned to him fully. "You must tell me, Mr. Bellamy, did you ever wonder who fathered the boy?" He scoffed. "Owners breed them all the time. Some white, some black. Makes no difference." "It makes all the difference," she whispered. "Especially when one of those men was not merely a planter, but a man touched by peculiar ancestry." Bellamy's eyebrows knitted together. "Ancestry? What are you accusing him of?" Genevieve stepped closer until Bellamy felt her breath on his cheek. "I am accusing nothing. I am telling you what I know. I recognized Lucien's face the moment I saw him. His cheekbones, his eyes, his uncanny symmetry." She paused. "He resembles a man painted in my grandmother's journal. A man buried by scandal. A French aristocrat who arrived in Louisiana in 1818 and vanished within months." Bellamy stared. "Plenty of French come and go. Not men like him," she countered. "Men who claimed to hear storms before they broke. Men who stood untouched during fevers that killed whole families. Men whose blood ran colder than the lakes in winter." Bellamy's skin prickled. "You speak of superstition," he muttered. "Nothing more." Genevieve shook her head, sadness deepening her voice. "You may call it superstition. My ancestors called it a gift. Others called it a curse." Her hand drifted toward her shawl. "In all our stories, the gift must never be owned." Bellamy backed away. "He's just a beautiful, quiet boy. Nothing more." "Then why did the doctor die the moment he touched him?" she asked softly. Bellamy opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Genevieve moved past him toward Lucien's corridor. "May I see him?" "No." She turned sharply. "If you keep him in that room, more men will die." Bellamy felt heat creep up his neck. "You think you can frighten me with ghost tales and Creole legends? I've run this trade for 20 years. And yet you tremble," she observed. He stiffened. Genevieve stepped closer, lowering her voice until the words pressed against him like a blade. "There are children whispered about in the old parishes. Children who do not cry. Children whose skin feels cold in the heat. Children who learn without being taught. Children who can Sense what lies beneath a person's breath. Bellamy felt the lantern behind him flicker again. My grandmother called them les silencieux, the silent ones. Some said their blood carried echoes from a lineage older than the colonies. Others claimed they were born to restore balance where cruelty ruled. Bellamy's hands shook. And what exactly do you think this boy aims to restore? Genevieve's eyes softened with something like pity. That depends on the men who try to possess him. Bellamy felt the hallway grow colder. She stepped back toward the door. Release him, she warned, or the city will bleed for your greed. Bellamy forced laughter, but it cracked like brittle glass. You expect me to walk away from a $20,000 offering? You expect me to abandon the greatest sale of my life? Genevieve paused at the door. You misunderstand me, Mr. Bellamy. Her voice darkened. I expect you to lose far more than money. She vanished into the night before he could respond, leaving the door rattling in the rising wind. Bellamy stood frozen, unable to breathe. Down the corridor, behind a locked wooden door, Lucien opened his eyes, as though awakened by the very words spoken about him. He had heard everything. The bloodline, the warnings, the fear. And what Bellamy did not know was that Lucien had already decided whom he would speak to first, and whom he would destroy. By the time the final auction night arrived, New Orleans was trembling with a fear it refused to name. A storm hovered above the city without breaking, trapped in a gray silence that pressed down on rooftops and seeped into the marrow of every man walking toward Bellamy's exchange. Inside, the building glowed with too many lanterns, as if Bellamy believed brightness could ward off the darkness gathering around him. Workers shuffled nervously, their movements sharp, their eyes darting each time a floorboard creaked. Even the horses tethered behind the exchange pawed the ground anxiously, snorting as though they sensed something approaching. Bellamy stood at the foot of the platform, hands shaking despite his attempt to appear composed. Tonight, he whispered to himself, I reclaim control. But the words sounded hollow. He didn't believe them. The bidders arrived one by one. Judge Keller walked with stiffness, eyes reddened from lack of sleep. Rousseau entered with a flask, taking long swallows as if courage could be bottled. 3 lesser planters hovered near the door, whispering about Hartlow's death and their own reluctance to return. Marchand arrived last, cane tapping sharply, expression grim. No one joked. No one bragged. The exchange felt like a church where a funeral was about to begin. At 8 o'clock, Bellamy stepped onto the platform. Gentlemen, he announced, his voice too loud, you are here to complete the most extraordinary purchase ever offered in this city. No applause followed. He swallowed hard. Bring him out. 2 workers opened the door. Lucien stepped into the hall. If his beauty had stunned them before, tonight it unsettled them. The lamplight touched his features like cold gold, sharpening every line of his face. His pale skin reflected a faint glow. His eyes, those calm ash-blue eyes, held none of the uncertainty or confusion Bellamy had tried to imagine into him. He was centered. He was aware. He was waiting. A shiver moved across the room like a ripple through tall grass. One planter muttered, he looks like he already knows the winner. Another whispered, he looks like he already knows the outcome. Marchand stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Why does he stand as though he has chosen something? Bellamy ignored the comment. Let us begin the bidding anew. But before he could speak another number, the door behind the platform slammed open. A gust of wind extinguished half the lanterns in the hall. Darkness swallowed the far wall. The shadows deepened, thick and restless. A worker cried out, storm's hidden early, but no rain fell. No thunder cracked. The storm waited, silent, coiled, deliberate. Bellamy forced a smile. Merely the wind. Rousseau shook his head. Wind doesn't choose doors. Lucien lifted his gaze toward the rafters as though listening to something above them, something none of the others could hear. A deep unease spread through the crowd. Enough. Bellamy snapped. We continue. 20,000 was the previous bid. Do I? His words were cut off by a sharp crack of lightning outside. The lanterns flickered violently. The room vibrated. Judge Keller suddenly spoke, voice shaking. Before we continue, I need an answer. The doctor died. 3 others have fallen ill. What is this boy? Bellamy raised his hands. Coincidence. Coincidence does not choke a grown man in seconds. Keller barked. Marchand stepped forward, cane pointed at Lucien. Ask him. Bellamy's breath hitched. Ask? Ask him, Marchand repeated. He understands more than you think. Lucien lowered his eyes. Silence spread like frost. Bellamy, trembling, forced a laugh. Gentlemen, he hasn't spoken a day in his life. He stopped, because Lucien was looking at him. Not staring, not observing, looking. Directly. Purposefully. A chill curled around Bellamy's spine. Marchand stepped closer. "Boy," he whispered, "tell us what you are." Seconds dragged. The lanterns flickered. The windows rattled. A distant rumble shook the foundation. And then, Lucien spoke. The first words of his life dropped into the room with the weight of a grave closing. "Do not let them touch me." His voice was low, smooth, almost gentle. But beneath it ran something ancient, something cold. Every man in the hall stepped back. Bellamy nearly fell off the platform. You can talk." Lucien's gaze did not move from the crowd. "Do not let them touch me," he repeated louder now. "Not one." Keller stammered, "Why? What happens if—" Lucien blinked slowly. "They chose this path." Before another question could form, lightning slammed into the ground outside the exchange. The building shook. The lantern over the platform exploded, showering sparks. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, tripping over chairs and each other. Workers scrambled for exits. The horses behind the building screamed and broke their posts. Bellamy grabbed the edge of the platform. "Stay calm. The auction isn't over." But even he knew the lie in that sentence. Marchand stared at Lucien with something like recognition. Or fear. "What are you awakening?" he whispered. Lucien lifted his chin slightly, as though listening to a voice none of them could hear. "I did not awaken anything," he said softly. "You did." Bellamy's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Lucien's eyes focused on him, cool, merciless, resigned. "You tried to claim something that does not belong to men." The storm finally broke. Rain slammed the roof. Thunder collapsed across the sky. Wind blasted through the shattered lantern glass, snuffing the remaining flames. Darkness consumed the hall. The confrontation had begun. The storm did not fall upon New Orleans like normal rain. It struck as if hurled from the sky by some unseen force. The moment Lucien finished speaking, a violent crack of thunder shook Bellamy's auction house so fiercely that dust rained from the rafters. The lanterns sputtered, flared, then died altogether, throwing the hall into darkness broken only by jagged flashes of lightning outside the high windows. Men screamed. Chairs toppled. Boots thundered across the floor. Someone cried out, get out now." Bellamy clawed for control, for composure, for even a shred of the authority he had once commanded. "Everyone stay where you are," he shouted above the deafening roar of wind. But his voice was drowned instantly. Lucien stood motionless on the platform, illuminated briefly by a lightning flash. His eyes reflected the stormlight like glass catching fire. The edges of his pale figure glowed faintly in the pitch darkness, making him appear carved from something colder than flesh. Judge Keller stumbled backward, cane clattering to the floor. "What is he?" he whispered to no one. "Dear God, what is he?" Rousseau tried to run, but the moment he touched the railing, a beam overhead groaned and cracked, sending splinters flying as he fell to his knees. "Help me!" Rousseau screamed. No one did. They were all running for their own lives. Marchand alone stood still, his cane trembling in his hand as he stared at Lucien. "I warned them," he murmured. "I should have known this day would come." Lightning struck again. This time, it hit the ground just outside the exchange, sending a shockwave that blasted the entrance doors inward. The wind that followed was not merely wind, it was a force, cold and heavy, rushing across the hall and extinguishing every remaining flame. Bellamy's voice cracked. "Guards, bring light, now." But the guards were already fleeing, pushing past one another, screaming as debris fell from the ceiling. Lucien stepped down from the platform with slow, deliberate grace. "Stop him." Bellamy shouted, desperation bleeding through every syllable. But no one moved. Even the boldest men in the room felt something pressing against their lungs, an unseen weight that made them stagger backward instead of forward. Lucien walked through the chaos untouched. A falling beam crashed beside him, exploding into splinters. The wind tore through the building, sending papers, fabric, and sawdust swirling around him like a cyclone, but not one fragment touched his skin. He moved as though the world bent around him. A worker attempted to grab him in a moment of panic, reaching blindly in the dark. His hand brushed the boy's arm. The worker screamed. He collapsed instantly. Men near him shouted and tripped over benches trying to get away. Marchand stared at the fallen man with horror. "He warned us not to touch him." Lucien did not look back. His steps were silent, precise, almost gentle as he crossed the collapsing hall. Bellamy, shaking, stumbled after him. "Where do you think you're going?" he yelled, voice breaking. "I own you. Do you hear me? I bought." Lucien stopped. He turned slowly. A faint glow from the storm outside illuminated his face, but his expression was not angry. It was sorrowful. "You cannot own what you cannot understand," he said softly. Bellamy froze. What are you?" he whispered. Lucien's eyes drifted upward, toward the ceiling beginning to bow from the pressure of the storm. "You will learn soon." Before Bellamy could respond, another violent strike of lightning rocked the building. The ceiling at the far end split open, sending shingles and debris cascading down. Screams erupted anew. Through the widening crack in the roof, the rain poured in, cold, relentless, drenching the terrified men as they fled toward the exits. In the confusion, Lucien stepped into the corridor near the back. Bellamy, fighting his way through overturned benches, shouted after him, "Guards! Stop him! Don't let him escape!" But the guards were gone. Every worker, every bidder, every living soul except Bellamy and Marchand fled the building, shoving their way through the shattered doors into the storm. Bellamy rushed toward the corridor, but the moment he reached the threshold, a portion of the ceiling collapsed, sealing the passage with broken beams and rubble. Lucien was already gone. Bellamy howled with frustration, pounding his fists against the debris until his knuckles bled. Marchand approached slowly, lifting his cane to inspect the blockage. "He is no longer yours, Horace," he murmured. "He never was." Bellamy spun on him. "This is your fault. You frightened the men. You poisoned the room with your superstitions." Marchand shook his head. "I merely recognized what stood before us. You refused to." Outside, the storm screamed across the city. Inside, the exchange continued to collapse in violent shudders. A massive beam above Bellamy groaned. Marchand lunged, shoving him aside just as the beam crashed down where Bellamy had been standing. "You saved me," Bellamy gasped. "I saved myself," Marchand muttered. "I refuse to be killed in your monument to greed." They staggered toward the rear exit, but as they reached the door, Bellamy turned back once more, eyes wide with manic obsession. "He cannot vanish. Not here. Not tonight. I will find him." Marchand's expression hardened into something like pity. "No," he said. "You will never find him." Because outside, on the far side of the burning exchange, several men swore they saw Lucien walking calmly through the flames, untouched, unburned, accompanied by silent silhouettes that melted away into the rain. By dawn, 2 more bidders were dead, each in their homes, with faces twisted in the same terror Hartlow had worn. By the end of the week, 6 men connected to Lucien's sale would lie in the ground, and Bellamy, ruined, frantic, consumed, would vanish without a trace. Dawn crept over New Orleans with a strange, unnatural quiet, as if the storm had drained the city of breath. The air hung heavy with the smell of soaked timber, scorched rope, and river fog drifting off the Mississippi. Smoke curled upward from what remained of Bellamy's auction house, its charred beams jutting toward the sky like the ribs of a carcass. Crowds gathered along the street, speaking in hushed tones, pointing, crossing themselves. "What happened?" "Storm hit like judgment. They say lightning struck inside the building." No, they say the boy walked through the fire like it was water." But no one could agree on the truth. They never would. By mid-morning, the coroner's men carried out the bodies. 4 retrieved from inside the exchange, 2 found dead in their homes after bidding the night before. Their faces were pale, frozen, and expressions twisted between fear and awe, as though they had glimpsed something they were never meant to see. The official report listed the cause as cardiac failure brought on by extreme atmospheric conditions. But the city did not believe that. Word traveled faster in New Orleans than any storm cloud. They whispered that the boy had killed them by looking at them, that he carried death like a shadow, that he was some kind of omen sent to punish the wicked. Some even whispered that he was not a boy at all. As for Horace Bellamy, he was nowhere to be found. His office stood empty, papers scattered across the floor, the ledger he guarded fiercely now lying open on a desk split by heat. His safe was untouched. His coat still hung on a chair. But the man himself had vanished. Witnesses claimed they saw him running toward the riverbank in the early hours, shouting that he would not die in his own house. Others swore they saw him stumbling toward the swamps, clothes torn, eyes wild, muttering the boy's name over and over. But Bellamy was never seen again. What no one knew, the narrator whispered, was that Bellamy died long before the storm ended, buried beneath the weight of his own fear. Genevieve Duclair watched from the steps of St. Louis Cathedral as the exchange smoldered. Her shawl fluttered in the gentle morning wind, but her expression remained calm, too calm for the horrors unfolding before her. Marchand approached her slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "You tried to warn him," he said. Genevieve did not turn her head. Men never listen when wealth calls their name. Marchand exhaled deeply. "And the boy?" She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the last traces of his presence in the air, the stillness he left behind. When she spoke, her voice was almost reverent. "He is gone." "Gone where?" "Where his blood calls him." Marchand looked toward the ruins of the exchange, where smoke rose from the ash of ambition, greed, and the men who thought they could own what was never meant to belong to them. "He walked through the fire," Marchand said. "I saw it with my own eyes." "No," Genevieve murmured. "He walked past it. Fire does not burn what it recognizes." Marchand swallowed. What was he? She looked at him at last, her deep brown eyes reflecting centuries of unspoken stories. "Some bloodlines refuse to die, Monsieur Marchand. Some come back to remind us that history is not finished with us." He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, plantation owners across the state tightened their patrols. Some forbade their slaves from speaking of the silent boy. Others threatened punishment for mentioning the name Lucien at all. But the story spread anyway. Children whispered it to each other at night. Fishermen swore they saw a pale figure walking along the lake at dusk. A preacher in Baton Rouge claimed a young man with ash-blue eyes came to confession and asked nothing in return but silence. Most dismissed these stories as fear-born inventions. Others suspected truth. What none of them understood, the narrator whispered, was that Lucien never intended to harm the innocent. Only those who reached for him with ownership in their hands. Years passed. New Orleans rebuilt the exchange, though business never thrived there again. Too many believed the land itself had been marked. Workers reported cold spots in the floorboards. Buyers claimed to feel watched. Some said they heard footsteps late at night, soft, precise, measured. Genevieve kept her grandmother's journal safe, her family's secrets locked away, though sometimes she felt the urge to open it and write. He came and left just as the story said he would. Marchand retired quietly, seldom speaking of the night that reshaped the city's whispers for a generation. When he did, he never described Lucien as a slave. He described him as something else. An inheritance, he would say. A reminder that the past does not sleep. And Lucien? He was seen. Or something resembling him was seen. Along remote riverbanks, in the shadows of cypress trees, on fog-draped roads leading north. Always silent. Always watching. Never aging, some claimed. Most dismissed such tales as fancy. But every few years, another story surfaced. A wealthy man found dead in his home, face frozen in terror. A plantation mysteriously abandoned overnight. A woman claiming a pale young man saved her child from drowning in a bayou. These stories were never proven. But they were never disproven either. What is certain, the narrator concluded, is that Lucien was not a curse. He was an answer, one the world was not prepared for and one it tried to claim before understanding the cost. Whether he was miracle, monster, or martyr, New Orleans would never forget the night the most beautiful slave ever auctioned walked through fire and vanished.